This Restorative Justice Life is a production of Amplify RJ. Follow us on all social media platforms at Amplify RJ, sign up for our email list, and check out our website at amplifyrj.com to stay up to date on everything we have going on. Make sure you're subscribed to this feed on whatever platform you're listening on right now so you don't miss an episode. And finally, we'd love it if you left us a rating and review. It really helps us literally amplify this work. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the episode. Welcome to This Restorative Justice Life, the podcast that explores how the philosophy, practices, and values of restorative justice apply to our everyday lives. I'm your host, David Ryan Barcega Castro Harris, all 5 names for the ancestors, and I'm the founder of Amplify RJ. On this podcast, I talk with RJ practitioners, circle keepers, and others doing this work about how this way of being has impacted their lives.
Hey folks, I'm Elise, your producer, and I'm so thrilled to introduce Barb Sherrod to the podcast today. Barb is a restorative practice program director, a reader, writer, mother, and a doctoral student studying urban educational leadership. In this podcast, Barb breaks down barriers and talks deeply about parenting and Black women and those connections to restorative justice. I'm so excited for you to hear this episode, but first I wanted to shout out some of the things we got going on with Amplify Restorative Justice. In addition to this podcast, we have been celebrating Black History Month in a number of ways. Please check out our Black Her Story reading list, which can be found in the show notes below, as well as our Black Abolition Workshop. Also, our recent podcast episodes have included authors of Colorizing Restorative Justice, and if you would like to get a copy of that book, check the show notes below. Now, without further ado, let's get into this conversation.
Welcome, Barb.
Hi.
Who are you?
I'm Barb. I don't want to say my last name. I don't know why. But I'm Barb. I am a Baltimore Black woman, born and bred, mother, writer, lover, fighter, healer, circle keeper, all that in between.
Who are you?
I am growing, learning, changing, a part of something bigger than self, frightened by the smallest things, like mice.
Who are you?
I exist and live with the goal to be happy and to be in community with people who want all people to be well.
Who are you?
I am the most silliest wet blanket you will ever meet.
Who are you?
I am the youngest of 4. I am the daughter of Lena and George, 2 blue-collar, middle-class Black folk who have survived the Civil Rights era, the Reagan era, the Bush era, the Obama era, the Trump era, and now as we transition into the Biden era.
Yeah. Who are you?
I am.
And finally, who are you?
I am the Restorative Practices Program Director for Restorative Response Baltimore. I am a first-generation doctoral student of the great Morgan State University, a national treasure and historically Black college, right here in the heart of the Northeast Baltimore, Maryland region. I am a person who loves deeply, a person who wants good things for self and others. I am...
Beautiful, beautiful. I know you said writer, but you didn't say that you are a contributing author to the book Colorizing Restorative Justice, which is part of why you're here today. We're going to talk about all those intersections of your identity. But before we do that, it's always good to check in with the fullness of the question. How are you?
I'm so I'm feeling good. I'm feeling at peace, and I'm feeling troubled. And I am well, right? I can say that I am well despite all that is happening in the world. And yet I still think about my responsibility because I am a part of this community. I am American, and so I just think about, like, what does it mean when we say we want a peaceful world, and we want to be able to live, and we want everybody to be safe and happy and healthy. And what does it mean when we recognize those things, and yet and still we entertain or we partake in the very processes or ceremonies that keep the same actions, right, alive, right? That keep the same behavior, culture, values, beliefs alive and well in the way of everyone being well and happy. So I'm sitting with that. Yeah.
How are we supposed to be celebrating like a more compassionate person, still at the head of like the American empire, right? That's steeped in white supremacy culture. Yes, it's not like a racist, narcissistic, like overt white supremacist in that seat, but still, like the system is not built for us. And we don't need to spend like all of our time talking about this because this isn't a current events podcast. But for me, I'm having similar feelings where it's just like there's relief. There's also a lot of sadness because of all that's been lost, all the lives that have been lost, all the harm that's been caused. Like, there are still children separated from their families, locked in cages at the border, right? Like, what does healing look like with all the division that has, proliferated over the last 4 years? Like, it's not because of him, but, that division still exists.
Yeah. And I think, like, and I listen to so many of our fam, right? I listen to so many Black, Brown, Indigenous folks like say, like, I'm feeling relief. And it's like, and I honor that, right? And like, it's so hard for me to feel the relief, right? Because it's like, globally, right, the relief it's felt and it's shared, but we know that in reality, we don't have nothing to be relieved about, right? Because it's just watching, folks say, I can't wait for some sense of normalcy. I can't wait for it. Well, it is normal. We've always been living in a white supremacist capitalist patriarchy. Like, the things that folks who have been structurally, intentionally, like, left out of, like, now all of a sudden, like, housing insecurity and the, financial insecurity that is being felt in a way that, like, many Americans have not felt ever, right? Like, and there are people who, like, they need help now and they're not getting it based on where they were a couple years ago. And that's saying something, right? And so it's like, I want to feel the relief. And also it's like, I just know that now that means, like, a lot of people aren't, like, folks don't feel as alarmed, right? Or there's the sense of urgency that was necessary, not the sense of urgency that that white supremacy tells us that there is, but the sense of urgency that we all feel around, like, creating the spaces where we can be well. I think that some of that has now been or the part of the responsibility has now been put back on the state, right? Instead of us as peoples recognizing, like, we're all we have, right?
For sure.
Yeah.
I'm thinking about how, we have a democratic, quote unquote, democratic legislative branch. We have, like, people who, we have, like, a Black woman and South Asian woman, like, who is, like, the dividing vote in the Senate, right? Or, she's, like, a heartbeat away from the presidency, right? And, like, my hope isn't there. My hope is in community, right? And people continuing to take care of each other like we always have. I'm curious what that looks like for you now. Because I think for me, I was doing this work before May of 2020. I was doing this work before, Trump was elected even, right? Like, and I'll still be doing this work now. So what does your work at all change?
No, no. If anything, I think that or so certainly it will, right? Because our work is always changing, because we as people, like, we are changing, right? We're flowing, right? We're growing. And so if the individual is doing all of that, then that means the community is as well. And what comes to mind is like, how do we continue this conversation in a proactive way, right? Because just going back to what I'm hearing, right? Again, like this, I'll keep lifting that up, like I'm ready to have some sense of normalcy. I'm ready to go, like, for kids to go back to school. I'm ready for this to be over. I'm ready to go back to the way things were. Okay, well, listen, me as a Black woman, when I hear that, what does that take me to, right? That takes me back to, my soror, Sandra Bland. Like, that takes me back to Corinne Gaines, a young Black woman who was murdered by the police here in Baltimore, like in Baltimore County. That takes me back to so many times where the state and even the community has failed Black women. Cis, trans, right? Like, there's not, and so when I hear that, it's like, well, what are we going back to? Because we just had this conversation around the ways in which, the state is, the state perpetuates, or the state is in charge of, right? Or speak clearly, right? The way in which, the American government is responsible for many of things. And we as the people, we put that in place. We vote for them, right? And so I'll ramble, I'm sorry, but like there, when I hear that, and especially as a Black woman, we're talking about the wealth gap. We're talking about how Black women are triple times more likely to die in giving birth than any other, right? And so it's like, when I hear these things, but now we're just now getting to, or for some people are just now learning about the way in which racism, the way in which sexism, right, the way in which misogynoir informs an experience. And it's just like, even trans misogynoir, and it's like, just people are just now getting to that conversation, right? And so it's like, so why quickly are we just like ready to go back now, right? And so I think about these things because, we've been having the conversations around restorative justice, and people are starting to get more interested in it more than before, right? Especially with, getting into restorative justice where the lens is not cishet white male, right? It is Black women. It is gender fluid. Like, there are so many, right? There's the identities that are outside of what white supremacy defines as humanity, right? There are people who are interested in understanding circle keeping from this lens, from these cultures, and it's like, but we have to, in knowing that, right, we are who we are in circle, but we also have to be that way outside of circle. And so I just, I don't want to keep rambling. I don't know if that makes any sense, but that's what I hear, right? And so it's like, but if we're talking about, in restorative justice, we acknowledge that everyone has a right to their humanity and dignity, right? If I'm saying, right, I have a right. This is what I know to be true, right? And I feel that I have a right to be safe, and that this is what I need to be safe. And so I'm concerned about how, again, the urgency and also what folks will see as essential to this work for the long term, and how much of the proactive work that has been done, hopefully how much of it will be sustained, and then keeping watch for and making plan for when folks put the work down and then something happens, because something will happen, right? And then there's like the response. So
for sure.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that, like, so many things in there.
I know. My mind is like.
Yeah. One of the things that I definitely want to pull out is like, that proactive piece, right? Like, we can't wait for the next Breonna Taylor or the next storming of the Capitol or the next whatever to like think like, oh, there's something wrong. No, like, to your point, like, normal has been harmful for so many people, and we need to continue. Like, it's almost not like it's not like it's really proactive. We're still being responsive to correcting the harms of the last 400 years, right? 400, 500 years, right? And like leaning on our ancestral practices, right? And our ancestral values of interconnection to get there to a place where, your human dignity, you're as a Black woman, like, you are thought of as equal in society. Not that other people are thought of as less, right? And like people are able to see your humanity, and not just, you know, you personally, but Black women, Indigenous women, gender nonconforming folks, right? Everybody who is marginalized as inherently human, and like our society doesn't do that. And so how does your work at Restorative Response Baltimore do that?
So I am responsible for restorative practices trainings. I created the restorative mindset training. I developed that with my, at the time, supervisor, Melanie Bell. We were working in a school where we saw the misogyny that the young Black girls were experiencing. They were in a building where they made up a great portion of the building, and yet the relationship, the treatment that they received from, especially just from all the educators in the building, it was very concerning to us, especially as this school was interested in implementing restorative practices. The school was also in the Roland Park community, which is, without going too deep, it comes up when we talk about redlining in Baltimore. And just seeing the dynamics of that school, which is surrounded by prominent private schools in the area, and the school, even though it was a public school, is very much so responsible for a lot of harms that those families, Black families in particular, experience. And so we were like, we were thinking, like, how do we start to work on this? How do we bring this, how do we put this forward to the to the adults, and then and then what do we need to do to start working forward? And so her and I had done a lot of her, myself, and another colleague at that time had done a book study and reflection over the things that we had learned over the years as circle keepers. And so we thought about Dr. Dweck's, it's her book on mindset. I always forget the name of it, but she talks about fixed mindset, growth mindset. And so we talked about, well, what would make a restorative mindset, right? Like, what do you need to, obviously critical thinking skills, right? But are we in spaces where we're developing critical thinking skills? So what do we need to be thinking about there? And so the training pretty much gets into all of that and talks about biases and how they play out. And we also name things, right? And so like the adultification of young Black girls, anti-Blackness, and what does that look like? Making the connection between the young Black girls as students and the Black women and the Black women that is a part of the community, right? How do you treat them? Because that is how you treat these young girls, right? And this is how we know that to be true, and holding space for folks to, based on how they identify, to point out the ways in which they have access to power, right? Not privilege, right? Because I think that's part of it too, is sometimes we soften it. Where they have access to power, right? And where that access to power is often reneged, right? And so just holding space for that conversation, whereas though there, it's from I, and people can't say, well, I disagree with that, right? Because it's something to be said when one person says, here's an experience I have, but here you are visually looking at all of these people, right? Who are saying, I've had an experience similar to this too. And it is, it's become a very, the training has changed our organization in many of ways. We transitioned, we often, not saying like, oh, it's chaotic. We often use circle process in our office for relationship building, even when we go through conflict. And oftentimes, I'll lead those circles. In schoolwork, we mostly work with adults. Part of like school implementation, what I've seen in terms of school implementation is folks put the responsibility on the kids to do the work, right? And so it's like this idea of like, shifting their behavior. And it's like, okay, well, where are they getting this behavior from? Especially because we believe that adults are like the holders of knowledge, right? And so the call is coming from inside the house, baby. Like, you are, as the holder of knowledge, like, you need to be changing yourself, you know? James Baldwin, one of my favorite James Baldwin quotes is, children are never very good at doing what they're told, but they're very good at doing what they see. And it's very true. We talk about often how children mimic the adults that are around them, especially ones that they love and admire. And so when we're talking about implementation, I'm always like getting school districts, just adults in general, even parents, to sit and think about that, right? Like, you know, here we are talking about social awareness and emotional intelligence. And then it's like, okay, well, can we sit for a second and think about our childhood and think about where we are when we were our children's ages, right? And what was going on for you. And then folks can, you know, start to dive and they're like, oh, well, shit, this harmful thing happened to me, especially in the school building. And it's like, okay, well, there you go. Right. And so it's like, if you can acknowledge, you know, for adults acknowledging, like, I've had this experience, and because I've had this experience, it's hard for me to tap into this emotion, right, or to tap into this behavior. And it's like, okay, well, if you can acknowledge that, then who are you, right, to assess if this child has that or not? What are you looking for? All you know to look for is what, you know, the deficit behavior, right? The deficit thinking that comes with that. And so really taking the time and coaching schools and adults with, like, you know, slow down. We don't got to rush into learning. You know, you don't got to jump into like, let me get trained in circles. Let's get trained in affective communication. I can train you affective communication all day long, but if you don't believe that children or the youth are your equals, then you're always going to struggle with that, right? Because that language requires vulnerability, a vulnerability that we don't believe, especially in Western culture, is one that should be afforded to anybody that is not at our status quo, right? At our status level.
Yeah. There's something about a couple episodes back, I was talking with Kay Pranis, and she was talking about how, you know, this work is more about values and assumptions, right, than it is about technique, right? So like, can you like use affective communication or a circle practice? Sure. Yeah, you can ask those questions. You can ask reflective questions. You can like pass a talking piece, but like, what are the assumptions that you're having about the people who you're having those interactions with? Do you see yourself as connected to them? Do you see yourself as their equal, right? That's so important. You know, you've been doing this work for a number of years now, and is, again, the question that normally happens a little bit earlier. We got a little bit off on a tangent.
I know. I will do that. I'm so sorry.
No worries. You know, you've been doing this work probably longer than you even knew the word restorative justice. Mm-hmm. So in your own words, how did you get started?
How did I get started? That question comes to me often. So the formal, you know, the academia was during grad school. I studied negotiations and conflict management. And we learned the 4 stories of justice, and restorative justice was one of them. And for some reason, I had just...
Sorry, what are the other 3?
Hell if I remember.
I'm like, I'm sure one of them is like retributive, but I'm not sure what the other 2 would be.
I think you're right. But
fair.
Don't get me to line. I think I have that book around here somewhere. But restorative justice just stuck to me, and I started to do some digging, and I came across research from, I want to say Dr. Jenkins, from Morris Jenkins, his research on restorative justice and the Geechee people and the Gullahs, because they still use the process. They still use circle keeping processes that their ancestors set from way back. And I just was like, okay, I like this. But then I also started learning about IRP, and I was looking at it and I was like, this still feels punitive. It still feels carceral. And also, this doesn't feel like something that will come from a white man. Like, I don't know. And at the time, I was also working in a school as a para. I was like just getting into education. And so schools then were like...
As a paraprofessional?
Mm-hmm. And so the school I was in had a large population of students experiencing housing insecurity. A lot of our students were undocumented. And so it was a lot happening in the school, and most of the school teachers were white women. And so cultural disconnect, racism, it just was rampant. And at the time they were requiring their behavior specialists who had just been trained by IRP to be, to lead the school implementation. And so I was at the time also interning with that school's behavior intervention specialist. And what I was reading, what I was watching, because I then found Community Conferencing Center. We're now RRB, but we were then Community Conferencing Center, Restorative Justice, Oakland Youth, like finding those videos and watching, and I'm like, this is not right. If this is about, creating community where, we recognize that accountability is shared, responsibility is shared, and relationships are built not through power and abuse, but instead, right, honoring one and, giving people, children included, because children are people, right, space to be themselves, right, that's, this is what this looks like. But the problem is it was still like sitting in circle and adult passing a talking piece that has no relevancy, no connection to them or to the children, just a big ball of rubber bands. And I was like, all right, how you doing today? Be quick. No. So I was just like, okay, yeah, this isn't it. How have I, in learning what gathering the language for restorative justice since I was born, when my aunties and my mama would sit around the table and talk their shit and talk about the ways in which people had done them wrong at work and even at home in the family. And they honored each other. They saw each other. They gave, they affirmed one another. They talked about the ways in which they was going to get justice on their own and how they could support each other through that. It truly is something when I think about when I think about the values that we even say that we uphold, or even right, and I think about even Ubuntu, right, and thinking about my own family and the connections to my grandmothers. My maternal grandmother in particular, I always felt because I grew up here in the Northeast and she's down south, and so I saw her once or twice every couple years or so. And growing into my own womanhood and learning that we had many similarities that defined who we are. Like learning that my grandmother had my aunt at 17. And I was 16 going to 17 when I had my eldest daughter. And so sitting with those and it's like, what does that mean for me? And that called me back into many conversations that we had as I grew into my teenagehood. And I'm like, something that she said to me didn't make sense then, right? And then it's like, okay, I've now gotten to this place and I'm thinking back and I'm like, okay, that's what she meant by that. Or even like thinking, seeing the relationship between myself and my mother. And that very much so informs my motherhood. It very much so informs my circle keeping, right? Because the way that I've come to know patience, I've come to know that because of her. And because of my aunties, even the community building, right? Like, if you ask me, I got 11 aunties, right? Obviously not all of them are blood, right? But the way in which, right, my mother nor my father took on the world by themselves, right? And by the world, I mean their children, right? Very much so a large family. Uncle so-and-so who's been around for this amount of time. I had the same next door neighbor all of my entire life, right? What does that mean, right? That new, right? And that same neighbor was the only, I don't give white people cookies, but Mr. Buck was the only white man who stayed in the neighborhood when my parents moved in. And this was like 1982 or something like that. And he stayed, and him and my parents, his wife, and then they got a divorce, and then his girlfriend, Miss Betty was there to the end. But him and his wife, and eventually Miss Betty were always supportive and always made sure that my family was safe, and that my parents felt like they belonged. At times, confronted other neighbors. Well, not at times, but when came time, confronted other neighbors. And so, very much so, I think about things that happened in my childhood, my teenage, from my familial ties, blood or not, and the way that I believe the work should be lived out, the way that I hear from the communities that I'm serving, that I'm a part of, the way it should be lived out. It's like, it's always been there. But most particular for me, it's always just been those memories of the Black women in my life sitting at the table, right? Sitting at the table, sitting on the front porch, sitting with their legs crossed, and somehow, some way, no matter how many, whatever time I can think back to, they were somehow, some way in circle, and that sticks with me. Yeah.
You talked about how, as a Black woman, right? But like Black women have always been the center of where you've drawn inspiration for doing this work. You're a contributing author to the anthology of essays, Colorizing Restorative Justice. Your chapter is entitled, Your Silence Will Not Protect You. We're going to talk about Audre Lorde in a minute, but I'm curious, as you were writing, who did you imagine your audience for that was? Was it, because I know like you have an exercise for Black women to do, right? And then for non-Black women to do at the end for people to reflect. Who did you imagine your audience being?
Black women. It was my when I formally got into the field of restorative justice, like by being a restorative practice specialist for RIP. My supervisors, the women who helped me transition into the work full time, were Black women. The literature that we read was Black women, right? It was, okay, this is inclusiveness is a tenet of restorative justice. Now let's go look for that in this literature. Okay, how come we're looking for that here? We've learned and we understand that when Black women are well, then everyone else is well, right? And when I say Black women, I'm including trans Black women, and I hate that we have to be explicit and say that. But right, when all Black women are well, then everyone else will be well, right? And so it was so important. And what I also found was also as and I still am as program director responsible for serving as liaison for our policy work, especially around like restorative practices and restorative justice in Maryland, and going to these meetings or being a part of these meetings, these committees, these subcommittees, and there were definitely Black women in the room, but it was mostly old white people. And it's like, well, you ain't been in the classroom in 15 years. You tell me, right? Like, how are you, who told you to be here, in a sense of like, if we recognize that the people closest to the problem are the ones with the solution, like, you are so very far away. And this I know to be true, right? Because we're sitting here having a training around bias, and we're supposed to be right. And we're supposed to be having a conversation around restorative justice, right? And then so it's like, what do you think is restorative justice then? If we can't, if it's too much to talk about race, if it's too much to talk about, oppressive frameworks, right? If it's too much to talk about what it would mean to distribute power to children, right? And so seeing that, and then also seeing the Black women that I'm in community within this work, seeing the way that they push back, seeing the way in which they certainly do not water down or shift who they are, or shift what the work means, and have no fear about the consequences, because they have time and time again shown that they are not the only ones doing this work, and that there are many who will certainly push back and step up when need be. And so seeing that, and then also experiencing the way in which white supremacist, capitalist, imperialist patriarchy was just running rampant in our own organization. We were not the organization was really struggling with living up to restorative justice values, and particularly in terms of how it was treating Black women. And so seeing that, and I just wrote this essay because for me, it was like, I want Black women to know, like, even in this work where we claim that, where, everyone who is a part of it is saying that all voices matter, right? And that we're speaking from the heart and that we're listening from the heart. It's, once again, we're being shut out, and yet we're expected to do the work. We're expected to hold the space, to be the circle keepers, to be the ones to, to show people how, to encourage folks to, exchange their weapon for their words, if you will, or, peaceful words, because we know words can be cutting. And so, I just really wanted, and especially for younger Black women, because the Black women that, here, and, is here in Baltimore, especially the Black women that at the time, and still are very much so here, that, wrap their arms around me, they have more skin in the game. And so, I certainly came in and I could be a little more mouthy and push the envelope a little more. And so I certainly, don't take that for granted. But I also wanted to, just let, have something where Black women, young, older, could see like somebody else. I'm not crazy. This is really what's going on. This is really happening. I'm not just making things up. I'm not just being bitter. But this is really happening. And I can choose to take it gracefully and peacefully and quietly, or I can raise hell and change some shit on my way out. That's what I really wanted.
Right, because there is risk when you speak up like that, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you talked about how you've seen examples of other people go before you and take those risks because those things need to be said. I'm curious if there was a time where you were silent and were harmed because of it.
Where I was silent and I was harmed because of it?
Right. I mean, your silence will not protect you.
Yeah.
What's the opposite of that?
So I always go back to the my organization because I think it's so important for organizations and the people who make them up to be honest about where they are in the work, especially when we're talking about the nonprofit industrial complex, right? And so when the two Black women that I worked with were fired unfairly, that was my entire team, and I had just came aboard. And so while I did speak up and, I was like, I don't understand, right? For the most part, I was silent because there were some things that I understood, right? Just being a Black woman in the workplace. And also there were some things that were going on before I had gotten there that while I had some background of, like, it just wasn't, I don't want to say, like, it wasn't enough for me to, like, speak out, because I certainly wasn't. I was very vocal about my displeasure. But the silence in terms of my workload and what was expected of me, right? I said nothing around that, right? Or the fact that I knew that I was going to need support. And so that got me, let's see, 18 months of the most abuse I've experienced in a workplace in my life, from being the only person responsible for implementing restorative practices in a school with 1,400 children, for completing or facilitating all of our restorative practices trainings, and having little to no support, being told that I had limited critical thinking skills, that the work was not getting done. It was torture. What I learned in my silence, and when I say my silence, what would have been loud for me, reflecting back, would have been to quit, right? and also knowing that I have 2 children that I had to care for, right? But the things we know, the things that we learned later on, at the time I didn't have it for that, and so I give myself grace. But staying was the hate and the abuse that had been reserved for them, right? Had to go somewhere, right? It had to go somewhere. It had to go to me, and so. From much of that, I've learned, right, that we have to speak up. We have to. The minute one of our sisters voices a displeasure, even if you don't understand, right, figure it out later. Fall in line. Did you hear what she said, right? Right, well, I see the value in this sister's work. I see the value in what this person does. I see the value in who this person is, right? Because Black women's our value should not be tied to what we do and what we're bringing to the table, right? But just in all that this person is, right? I see them, and I also see, right, being able to say, like, and I also see when, how you're treating this person, right? And there's nothing about me that makes me no exception from how you're treating this person. One of the things that I told my sister friend when she joined as a colleague, while we were still white male led, was I was like, one of the things that I've learned here is that you are a favorite until you're not. Mm-hmm. And so by no means did I escape the harm. Was the harm that I experienced, I don't even think that I would even measure it, because the harm is the harm, and their humanity and dignity was very much so striked at, as was mine. It's also why I am so vocal about people needing, especially in this work, and most particular white men, needing to shut the hell up and just shut up. Talk to each other when you understand why, right? Talk to each other about how you can dismantle white supremacy. Talk to each other about that. Talk to each other about, what it means to, like, listen to Black women. That's where I'm at with it. Like, when it comes to, when it comes to white men in this work, because it's like, very few that I interact with where I see that incorporating philosophy and the tenets of restorative justice into their lives. And that is something that sits with me, because I see the Black women that I'm in community with. I see the brown women that I'm in community with, the indigenous women. Like, I just see the commitment to this work through and through, internally and externally. And so it's like, well, if we can hold that expectation for each other and clear and not, in a way in which I'm gonna leave it at that. But just, right, being able to hold that expectation and follow through with the support for each other, Black women, non-Black women of color, and being able to hold space when we're having trouble living through that. That's the expectation that I have for white men. And when it comes to everybody else, I've seen that from everybody else. I just have not seen that consistently from white men. And so that experience that we had, I think, definitely informs that very much so.
For sure.
Yeah.
At multiple points in the chapter you shared, you reference Audre Lorde. The title comes from the Cancer Journals, but you reference her multiple times. How has she impacted the way that you think about, really life, but this work?
I love Audre Lorde. Oh my goodness. So first of all, Sister Outsider, I came to Your Silence Will Not Protect You, that the essay, because of Sister Outsider. I had just finished it, or it was just about finished it, and I was just blown away with, like, reading this essay where she basically was like, you may as well just get it off your chest, because guess what? Whether you say something or not, this shit's still gonna happen, right? Like, that's the whole point, right? And she's like, and I'm dying, and I realized that, in this whole process that, like, say it or not, but this was going to happen. Right. And so I can have some control. I can have some say in it. Right. I can choose. Right. What I want to speak life to and what I don't want to speak life to, what I want to put down, pick up, or I can just let other people do it for me. Right. But at the end of the day, this thing will not change. It's still going to harm me. And it was just like, whew. Okay, sitting in circle, right, where we're using this thing to respond to conflict. We're using, right, to build better relationships. And watching for many of reasons, watching people, myself included, shy away from naming things that really needed to be named. Mm-hmm. Right? And I think it gets so much heavier when that hand comes around in the circle. I'll just use, right, when that hand comes around, when that talking piece comes around for us to free ourselves from things. And there's nuances to it, right? Like security is one thing. And so naming that tyranny in that space may not be safe at that time, right? There may be another time for that, maybe another circle for that. But what her work, just, it really gave me permission and to say, when she talks about eroticism, right? Like, you should feel pleasure. Duh. That's what that's why you like that thing, that tingling. Yeah, it's okay, right? Audre Lorde's work for me has given me some insight to shame. It has given me insight to how we build relationships with one another, particularly her essay, Eye to Eye, Uses of Anger, where she talks about Black women, and she says, we reserve a particular, Black women have a particular voice that we reserve for critique solely for Black women. And so it's like, well, this is a dynamic that I have to explore, right, with myself. And so very much so her work laid a foundation for me to explore my relationship with myself as a Black woman first, which is when we think about restorative justice, right? And we always talk about, again, going back to Ubuntu, I am because we are. We always talk about the importance of self-exploration, especially as a circle keeper. And so saying that I'm holding space intentionally for Black children, intentionally for Black men, intentionally for Black girls, intentionally for all of us, right? Trans, disabled. I'm holding space for all of us, and so I need to do my work. And in holding space for all of us, right, my work is how am I lifting up the violences that the people I claim to be in community with experience daily, right? So in Audre, she does that's something else that I find that she does well, especially when I'm sorry, I was blinking, and she touches on it a bit in Zami, where she talks about the relationship she built with other Black women who are lesbian, and she reflects on that. And even in Alice Walker, Anything We Love Can Be Saved, where she talks about the discourse or the disagreement she had with Audre Lorde's comment around, and Alice Walker's another Black woman who I very much so admire and influences my work, where she talks about the disagreement that they had around Audre Lorde's commentary on The Color Purple. And what they, without getting too deep into the story, they walked away with a deeper connection, a deeper understanding, a deeper love for one another. And it's something that comes up in Audre's work often, and something that comes up in Alice's work often is loving folks past disposability. And love is not always this kind, gentle, flowery thing we think it is, or we believe it to be, or want to believe that it is. And in our work, right, we say that everyone belongs, and so that is hard work, the work that comes from that. And so Audre, to me, in very much so plain speak, in everyday, extraordinary and ordinary being, I think she does a great job in capturing those things for me, right? The actions, the counteractions to disposability, as well as like holding space for yourself. That was so long.
No, that Well, what I'm thinking is like, what the world needs is a podcast hosted by Barb breaking down each of Audrey's essays. So, like you've taken inspiration from so many people, right? But you're a writer yourself, not just in CRJ. What are some of the other things that you've been writing? And like, if you want to like plug like the dissertation things and like all those things.
Dissertation things. So, I have my blog, Millennial Mocha Moms. I don't know if you saw. I have not. The last piece I wrote was a piece for Breonna Taylor. And since then, I have not published anything. I have been working on a few pieces, and as well as I'm working on something in restorative justice. I don't want to give too much away right now. The problem is that I'm having imposter syndrome. And so very much so in my head around, like, who am I to say that this is what we need to be doing, and, here's how we need to be doing it. I struggle with that because I very much so believe that the wisdom is in the community. And so I want to write the book, and I'm also like, but the book is coming from me and not the community. And so I'm trying to get past.
Well, I mean, I would turn that back to you and say, if you look at Audre Lorde, like, she wrote the book based off of her experiences through the community.
Yeah.
Right? Oh, she wrote the essays, right?
All right, David.
Through her experiences in community, right? Like, you're Barb. Like, you got this.
Yeah, I appreciate it. I received that. Yeah.
The world needs this. I'm curious, because we're going to keep some of those things under wraps. I'm curious, what are some of the other things or some of the other areas that you're trying to grow in now?
I'm really trying to explore more of pulling parents into like building curriculum, restorative justice, restorative practice curriculum, and also creating community or learning spaces where parents can acquire the tools and resources for this work without it being so formal and technical. We know that this work we know that circle keeping and, the tenets of restorative justice have been around for forever, right? And knowing that it's a matter of returning, I guess, I'm saying this for lack of better wording, but just returning it back to everyday life and community, right? Like now it's in spaces of, it's in academia now. And so, that's an institution itself. And what does that mean when we're talking about a philosophy where we're saying we're valuing people over property, we're valuing relationships over power, right? That, we don't have to engage in a power struggle. We can just redistribute as necessary when necessary. So all of that, just trying to get that in a space where it's something that can, and not necessarily so high up like that, but just in terms of like, can we create the spaces where we can support parents in using language that is affirming and loving for themselves and for the youth that's in their homes?
How, like, you're a parent.
Yeah.
How has that showed up for you?
Oh my goodness. Whew, let me tell you something. This past 300 and something days in house has been so eye-opening, and I'm parenting in two different spaces. So I have my eldest daughter, Tatiana. She will be 12 in March, and Yahar is 5.5, but she'll be 6 in July. And so raising a middle school Black girl, as well as having one in early childhood and preparing to go into her primaries, and really in two different spaces, right? Communication-wise, expectations and values-wise, right? Like across the board, the shared not understanding is mommy loves you and I want you to be your best self. And so with that, what are the conditions and the environment that you need to thrive? And on the flip side of that, mommy wants to be her best self. So these are the necessary conditions and environment that I need to thrive. And we need to figure out how to make all of that happen together, right? And then what are you responsible for, right? And I'll tell you what I'm responsible for. And so that's how it is in my house, in theory. In action, it's World War III. And so, I don't hit my children. We yell. I don't, but it's not, a verbal, like, go sit your ass down and shut up over there. It's just like, what's happening?
There's a difference between raised voices and like verbal abuse, right? Yeah.
Right. It's like, I know y'all not fighting again. Like, it's literally like, because conflict is inevitable, right? And so recognizing, and also I have 2 little girls. And so my sister and I are 7 years apart, me and one of my sisters. And so that very much so is the dynamic in my house. So I have some wisdom when it comes to that. So, it feels a little better, but I do not spank my children. We use bugs and wishes, especially for my little one. So she can say, it bugs me that her cookie was bigger than mine, and I wish you would give me the bigger one next time. Right. We take deep breaths. We journal. We share when we're not feeling happy and, what we need to feel happy. We work on our boundaries. We're honest about when we're having a hard time honoring boundaries. That's, and I think, and that's something that I really wanted to, trying to capture for parents, especially because one of the challenges that we have, that I have, and that as an organization we have with getting folks to recognize, is that this is a relational process and philosophy. And because of that, this is not linear. Right. And some things are just not quantifiable. And, and so it's not always, sitting in a circle at home. We live this work out in action, because there are times when my children are just not their best selves, and I'm not my best self. And we very much so give grace. And we also come back around and say, that thing that you did, I did not like that. So we need to figure out what got you to this place and how that does not happen again.
And I think, like, you doing that to your kids is so important, right? Showing them where, like, I was not my best self, right? I caused harm, and I'm sorry about that. Like, how can I do better for you? Like, that's not something that happens a lot, and is, to James Baldwin's point, like, children follow what they see demonstrated, do what they see modeled, and being that model is so important, of being able to apologize, and not always think that you're right.
Yeah. And not repeat it, right? Because for a time there, where we were really like, okay, where myself and my co-parenting community were like, okay, like, let's really think through these things. Sometimes as adults, we rest on just apologizing and acknowledging for our youth, and that's great, but we have to go past that. We have to actually stop the behavior. We have to actually change the behavior. And so my Tatiana and I had a conversation a couple weeks ago where we were talking, more than a couple weeks ago, because Christmas, we were taking the tree down, and she was like, there's water in there? And I was like, yeah. And she was like, she instantly got annoyed. And I was like, what are you getting annoyed for? And she was like, the way you said that, she was like, when I heard you respond with your tone, she was like, what I heard was an assumption that I was supposed to know these things. First of all, this is my 11-year-old, so I'm pretty proud of myself. Especially because on a normal day, I can't get this kid to, like, hey, how are you? Good. Okay. She's getting into that point. But, and narcissism aside, about look at this wonderful kid, but that I've raised. But what struck me was, one, she was able to say, like, what, she gave language to what it was that she was experiencing, which we all know as the term condescending. But in that, right, in listening to her, she also set the boundary of, you are placing expectations around my knowledge, right? The expectations you have for yourself around your knowledge on me, and I'm not a part of that. I'm not asking for that. And so when she said it, I was like, I'm so sorry. Thank you for pointing that out. I recognize that you know things, and I even said to her, and I uplifted her, and I said, and I recognize that there are a lot of things that I come to you about, because I know that you have knowledge in so many areas. And so I was like, and I apologize that I took that, right, that confirmation about this thing and assumed it here. And so then I explained, I was like, well, the tree is still living, right? Even though it's been cut off right? And so we still have to put water in it. Otherwise, the pine needles will dry up and fall off. And I'm like, you remember when we went to North Carolina last year and forgot to water the tree and it was brown? She was like, yeah. So it was like, that was that. And so, when we're open to it, our children can teach us a lot. And it also got me thinking, like, how many times has somebody called me condescending or a know-it-all? And I was like, yeah, shut the fuck up. You don't know what you're talking about. And I didn't hear them, right? And for various reasons. I probably wasn't being heard themselves, right? I probably wasn't being heard myself. And that's not an excuse, certainly, right? But again, if we're talking about the conditions and the environment necessary to thrive, right, being listened to is one of them. And so I think about, because I've been, we have been so intentional in, when our children are speaking to us, we stop and we look at them and we give them eye contact, right? When we respond, or even in being honest and saying, you know what, I'm doing a lot right now, baby, and so I'm having a hard time being present. Can you hold that thought for a few minutes? And then let's come back to that. Because I know that I'll be distracted by this thing and I can't listen to you fully. I can't give you myself fully. Being able to name that, and sometimes they're not okay with it, right? And because, again, right, especially depending on the age, right, their age group and where they are. Like my 5-year-old, she don't want to hear that. Wait, everything's about me, sis. Drop the pen. Like, cut it out. Nobody else exists. Not even that one right there that came before me. Like, and so just going through those, and it doesn't always feel good in the moment either, right? Because as adults, the urge to control the situation, we need to feel like we're in control and that, we have say. And so recognizing that too, like that is so, it can be a lot. And also recognizing, it can be a lot. And also I see the benefits long-term of recognizing that my children are their own, they are their own selves. And I can share, and, I'll share all parts of me with my children. And I welcome them to, take on what they love about me, right? Even maybe see if that's a part of their own identity, right? Or just say, I honor and appreciate that. And thank you, right? Here's what I will not do. I think that's it, right? And so trying to capture that right now so that we can create really, 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 really create space for parents in our work like we say that we are. Yeah.
I can't let this go because my wife listens to this podcast and she's not going to let me go without saying, like, yes, that condescending thing, that's me too. I need to continue to work on that. I need to be accountable for that and not just like do that, not just acknowledge that harm, but like continue to change and work on that behavior. So, public accountability, still working on it.
Listen. And I just, and you know what? And also, so, and my romantic friend, and we were discussing, Hamilton, and I had questions. I'd never seen it, but I had questions. And so he says to me, like, often you are so sure and right about everything. And he was like, there's just no other truths in this world. And for me, I immediately shut down because I was like, well, and he was just like, it's very much so like arrogant. And I knew what was like being said because the whole condescending thing. And when that happened, I could recognize the difference in the feedback and how it was given. Right. And so I shut down for a minute and then I came back and then I said, when I hear someone label me and define me as arrogant or a know-it-all, I have a hard time being authentic in conversation with them afterwards because I'm not sure if it's authentic feedback or is it just frustration with the fact that I can certainly recognize and honor your truth and not claim it as my own, right? In terms of Hamilton, there are other things where it's like you certainly absolutely need to take that in consideration, right? But in terms of, and so like I reckon, and so we ended up talking a little more about it. Like there are other ways that we can give this feedback, and also projection. It's certainly, the difference was there was definitely a difference between the two. But we're working on it and still we rise, David. It's not our fault that we like to read and know things. Everybody else should read and know things too.
I want to transition us into the questions that I ask everybody.
Okay.
Restorative justice is
A way of being where everyone, even folks you don't know, are thought of.
You get to sit in circle with 4 people. Who are they, and what do you talk about?
Oh man, we're gonna be here all day. Audre Lorde, for sure. Toni Morrison. My great great grandmother Elizabeth. And my grandmother Lucy. Yes. Sis
What would
had
you
some
talk
trips
about?
to Mexico that I heard of, and I need deets. But what will we talk about? I'd ask them so many questions about motherhood, how they managed to find themselves and be themselves in times where it was especially not okay for Black women to define themselves and take ownership of themselves, to learn especially how to speak directly to our people. Yeah.
What is a restorative practice that you've been really leaning into recently?
I'll be honest with you. Recently, I have not done so well with restoring myself. Yeah. And maybe that's it. Maybe I have been, because I'm usually like neat and orderly, make time to do this. And like right now, I'm just kind of like, just gonna order some food, brush my teeth, and see how the day goes. Takes more energy to take care of yourself than to not. But I really, I'm always striving to listen deeply, and will be better at listening deeply. So that's just my go-to answer, and I sincerely mean it.
For sure. You've given so much, but what is one thing you wish everyone listening to this podcast would know?
The call is coming from inside the house, so tend to your business. This is not something that we're doing to. And that was it too, David, earlier when you were like, you're doing this to children. I'd like to emphasize that I'm doing this with my children. Right. They very much so, I see them as people who are subjects who are worthy of being honored and praised and have valuable knowledge to bring forth. And so something for everyone is do this with the people that you are in relationship with, especially people who, when we look at those relationships in the traditional punitive, carceral, or hierarchical relationship lens, right? When we look at them with those lens, we typically view their voices, what they bring to the table, and who they are with less value. And so be intentional about doing things with people. Offering choice and listening, not listening to respond, but just listening. Yeah,
for sure. This question comes with a caveat. Who's one person that I should have on this podcast? The caveat is you have to help me get them on.
What? One person you should have on this podcast. Dr. Monique Morris, author of Push Out. Yeah. I don't know if you read Push Out, but her research came out in 2016, 2017. I also used it for my master's capstone. Brilliant, and she talks about the adultification, misogynoir, the state-sanctioned violence that young Black girls experience in schools and all the way through. So basically, like outlining the school-to-prison pipeline for Black American girls. And she talks about her use of restorative justice, so using the circle process with the girls in their communities.
We're going to make it happen.
Yeah, we'll see. I emailed her once. She ain't emailed me back.
We'll make it
I'll
happen.
send a follow-up email. We'll make it happen.
And finally, how can people support you in your work in the ways that you want to be supported?
Certainly, Millennial Mocha Moms. I'm working on, one of the pieces that I'm working on is understanding the use of cannabis, one as herbal medicine, but also recreational, and using restorative justice to address the criminalization that Black women in particular experience because of cannabis, either distributing or consuming, and the implication and roles that society plays on that. And so, like, even the notion of motherhood and who gets to be and who's the image of motherhood, which is usually white women, and how society, what's the word that I'm looking for? Encourages or normalizes, like, alcohol abuse and prescription drug abuse for mothers, particularly for white women. And yeah, so I'm working on that right now.
Cool. So the website, it's also on Instagram, right?
Mm-hmm. And you can follow Millennial Mocha Moms. I also but it's also, if you'll see that I'm not the only contributing writer, I created the space for Black millennial mothers who wanted to share their experiences as mothers. It does not necessarily have to be tied to parenting. I just want to, create a space where Black women can be more than just our motherhoods, where we recognize that it is an essential identity to us, yes, and so much more. But more than welcome to follow, love the support. Any Black women who are listening that are mother, auntie, guardian to children, Black children, and would love to submit a piece, they're more than welcome to. And that's it.
No, that's plenty. So grateful for the time and the wisdom, the vulnerability that you've shared with us. I've definitely been challenged, and I know, and I've learned, and I know that so many other people have as well. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me on. I'm so excited.
Well, this has been our conversation with Barb. Thank you, everybody, so much for listening, and we'll talk to you again next week.
Wow. Thank you so much to Barbara for all of your amazing thoughts today. This is Elise here, and I'm going to give you a few of my closing ideas. This episode honestly really made me think. As a mixed person of color myself and as a female, I felt really heard by this episode, and I felt really connected to this. It felt like a story for people of color, from people of color. And some things that really stuck out to me included, your silence will not protect you. This statement was used in her portion of Colorizing Restorative Justice, and it is so powerful. Oftentimes when I think of why people are silent, it is for protection, it is for safety. And this statement, your silence will not protect you, breaks down that level of comfort and forces us to be a little bit uncomfortable, always. Also, I really appreciated the ideas that she brought regarding parenting. Although a lot of her advice was geared toward a younger audience with that, I think that everyone can take some of those pieces and put them into their own life. For example, when her children are sad, she encourages them to journal and express those emotions, which I think is super important, and building emotional intelligence is extremely key to restorative justice. So I ask you, how are you going to work to be more emotionally vulnerable with yourself and with others? Thank you so much for listening today, and I want to quickly remind you of our workshops and Black History Month events. Please check out our Black Her Story reading list, the Colorizing Restorative Justice book, and our Black Abolition Movements workshop. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.
Like what you heard? Please subscribe, rate, review, and share this podcast on whatever platform you're using right now. It really helps us further amplify this work. You can also support us by following us on our social platforms, signing up for our email list, rocking our new merch, joining our Patreon, or signing up for a workshop. So many options! Links to everything in the show notes and on our website, amplifyrj.com. Thanks so much for listening. We'll talk to you next week.